in developing nations. The breakdown left many upset.
I'm incredibly angry, I'm incredibly sad. I have already cried, now the anger prevails. I think this is an absolute disaster for the climate. It's a disaster for millions of people that have been watching governments here for weeks, that have been watching governments for 3 years to try to come to an agreement that can then be implemented.
To date, no industrialized nation has ratified the Kyoto Protocol. Another meeting is set for Morocco next year. And now we get two perspectives on the climate talks from writers. Greg Easterbrook, the senior editor at the New Republic and author of A Moment on the Earth, The Coming Age of Environmental Optimism, and Mark Hertsgaard, author of Earth Odyssey, Around the World in Search of Our Environmental Future. Greg Easterbrook, for a long time, Kyoto was portrayed at its core as an argument between the developing world and the rich industrial world. How did this end up in The Hague, coming down to an argument between Europe and the United States?
I think because the United States and Europe have very different perspectives. The United States proposed a realistic, practical, pragmatic plan that could be passed and put into effect. The Europeans were more interested in ideological posturing, certainly not all of them, but I think France and Germany especially saw this as an opportunity to denounce the United States. Were more interested in punitive restrictions on American industry than they were on practical economic tools such as carbon trading, which have a much greater potential for reducing greenhouse gases in the world.
So you reject the critique specifically from those countries you mentioned that said the United States was trying to get through Kyoto the easy way?
Oh yes, this deal was torpedoed by the European Union, and very foolishly so. Now, it doesn't mean that there won't be a better deal at some point in the future, but what the Clinton administration proposed was carefully thought through and practical, and yes, it wasn't exactly what the Europeans wanted, but the United States is the 500-pound gorilla of the global warming issue today, and if you want that gorilla to eat fewer bananas, you're going to have to give him a deal that he's willing to accept, and especially that the U.S. Senate is willing to ratify. Mark Hertsgaard, do you agree with that analysis?
I'm afraid I don't, no. Look, the United States was trying to get something for nothing, largely with this talk about how forests are going to solve all the problem, these sinks that you mentioned in your setup piece. But look, those sinks are operating now, and that is not getting us closer to solving the problem. And, you know, when Greg says that this was a practical program, it was practical in the sense, perhaps, of what was needed to get through the United States Congress. But you cannot blame other countries for being impatient with that line of reasoning. Look, the planet does not care that the United States Congress, like an ostrich, wants to stick its head in the sand on this issue. This problem is here. We have to do something about it, or the 21st century is going to be a very hot place. And what the United States proposal offered was really not enough to get us where we need to go on this.
Some of the early reporting that was coming out of The Hague, Mark Hertsgaard, mentioned that even though it was very combative, they were close, and that some of the final clashes came over specific formulas. Were they really that close to coming out of The Hague with an agreement?
Well, you know, it's hard for us to know. We weren't there in the room, but it sounds like it was pretty close. There was a handshake deal at 3 o'clock in the morning between U.S. and European negotiators, and what happened was that when the European negotiators went back to their people, they couldn't sell it because there were loopholes in there big enough to drive a supertanker through in the view of the Europeans. And, you know, green politics and green points of view in Europe are simply much stronger than they are in the United States, and the NGOs and the green parties were not going to sit still for that.
Is there a price to be paid politically for either side in the argument, coming away from The Hague with no agreement?
Well, I think Europe should pay, especially France and Germany, should pay a high price for looking very foolish. They talk greener than thou. They say they want global warming progress, but here they have the United States willing to agree to something, and they torpedo the deal. And the deal that's being proposed is not just papering over the issue. Carbon trading would have the effect of transferring American capital and technology to the developing world to make energy use more efficient there.
Let me have you stop right there and explain, for those who haven't been following the issue, just what carbon trading is. Would there be an exchange?
The basic principle that's been endorsed by economists all over the spectrum, from Paul McCracken, former chief economic advisor to Ronald Reagan, to left-wing environmental economists, is that we would trade the right to emit carbon dioxide, trade it mainly with the developing world, where energy use is much more inefficient than it is in the West. And the effect of such trades would be that American companies would pay power plants, say in China, that Mark is very familiar with, where he's traveled a lot. Chinese power plants burn 6 times as much coal per unit of energy produced, and thus 6 times the greenhouse gases, as power plants in the United States. If we used American technology and American capital to improve the efficiency of those power plants, greenhouse gases would decline, Chinese acid rain would decline, and this could be done at a much lower price than realizing marginal improvements in the United States. Economists across the spectrum.
But what would be, just so I understand this better, what would be the incentive for American capital to help put those investments in place to reduce Chinese emissions? Would they get some give on the United States side of the Pacific?
Yes, they would get out of, in the European language, having to cut their own emissions themselves. There would be permits. You would either have to cut your own emissions, or you could buy reductions in emissions from other countries. And America certainly could more cheaply buy reductions from developing world countries than it could stage the reductions itself. And this is at the heart of the European response. Europe emotionally wanted to see the United States suffer in this agreement. They wanted us to be hurt. And the proposal that we made would have been much better for the planet, cheaper, faster in terms of greenhouse reductions, but it wouldn't have hurt us. And that, to Europe, was emotionally unacceptable.
Mark Hertzgaard?
Well, I don't know how Greg knows that the Europeans want to hurt us. I'd be interested to know how he's able to read their minds. But I do want to agree with him about the importance of changing energy patterns in China, in India, and elsewhere. And yes, there's a strong economic argument for doing that. I don't think you need the Hague proposals to make American capital profitable in that sense. There's a huge market out there. We should be going after it whatever happens in the Hague. But the politics of this are very important. You cannot, if you're the United States and you are the 800-pound gorilla, you cannot expect the rest of the world to restrain its energy use when you don't want to do it at home. That is simply a non-starter. In China, for example, when you talk to the officials there, they will say, look, we are not, how dare you preach to us about this when you don't want to change at home? You know, just this last week in India, there are riots in the streets of New Delhi. Why? Because the Supreme Court of India is shutting down polluting factories. And those workers and the owners of those small factories are saying, look, how dare you put us out of work? The $55 I earn a month is keeping my family alive. And yet Delhi is one of the most polluted spots on the planet.
Well, how did that visit itself on the deliberations in The Hague, though? Did the Third World end up just being a bystander to a Euro-American fight?
Well, I think that was one of the real oversights there. And that issue, unfortunately, does tend to get left to the end of so much of both the political discussions and the media discussions. But look, this is where the climate change game is going to be won or lost, is in China, is in India, Brazil, Mexico, these countries that are going to have a better life in the next 20 years no matter what we do. And we have to find a way to power their economies with solar and non-carbon-based fuels. We should be doing that no matter what happens in The Hague because it's profitable for our companies. But it doesn't help for us to be saying, no, we can't possibly change here in the United States.
Greg Easterbrook, is Kyoto dead?
No, it's not dead. The treaty itself, negotiations will continue. What was signed in Kyoto may fail, but if it fails, we revert to the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the cumbersomely named treaty that has been ratified by the United States Senate, that would require us to continue negotiating, and perhaps we'll come up with a better and more flexible deal. Other nations are interested, and India, that Mark mentions, is a great example. 3 years ago at Kyoto, India was very opposed. They felt that the greenhouse restrictions were some kind of conspiracy to take away their economic development. Now they favor the treaty. They've realized that it would result in a shift of capital to the developing world. India is one of the biggest backers of the Kyoto Treaty today. And I think many developing countries, once they understand that carbon trading will mainly benefit the poor nations of the world, will be in favor of it. It's Europe that's standing in the way.
And really quickly, Mark, does who becomes President of the United States in January have a lot to say about the future of Kyoto?
I think not, because you know, obviously Mr. Bush, from an oil industry background, is not going to be much of a leader, but Mr. Gore wasn't either in the past 8 years, and the real problem is in Congress. They, 95 to nothing, were against Kyoto before it was even signed. So that's the real issue, is the fact that the Congress responds so much to big oil money and the public. You know, Americans are very used to and spoiled by having very cheap energy, and that's just not going to be able to continue.
Do you agree with that?
In the short term, I think Mark is correct. In the long term, I think reforms are possible. A post-fossil fuel economy is in our interest regardless of what happens to the climate. Eventually, we will need to move beyond fossil fuels, and I think eventually Congress will understand that. Market forces may help bring it about. The United States certainly could benefit from higher energy taxes if other taxes were cut at the same time, so that the net effect on consumers would not increase. Many economists have endorsed that as well, and at some point, Congress may wake up.
Greg Easterbrook, Mark Hertzgaard, gentlemen, thank you both.
Thank you.
Conjures up images.